morning. This morning with Hometown Histories, we're going to be talking to two residents from Wayside. My name is Marge Ellison. I am a trustee of the museum, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you Wayne and Sheila Jackson. They are longtime residents of Wayside, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the farming history of our town, mainly in the Wayside area. Wayne, I'd like to ask you to give us a little background on the farm that you now live on and that has been in your family. Tell us how long.
Well, I did a little bit of family background research with the help of my nephew and Ancestry.com. We got some of the census records, and we started with 1910, found my grandfather and my father, and then went backwards to 1850. And on that we came up with going census by census with my great-great-great-grandfather and a number of children that he had. So I know that by census we've been there since 1850. We do show on that census that my grandfather was 57 years old then, so I'm assuming that we're talking 1798 or prior.
Wow. Long-time residents and long-time property owners here in town.
That's what I call a nice start.
Yeah. And Sheila, you aren't from Ocean Township specifically, but you're from...
Colts Neck. I grew up in Colts Neck, and then when Wayne and I got married, of course, moved into the house we're in now.
Okay.
And it was going to be our starter house, and we're still there 50 years later.
Great. Well, was your family a farm family in Colts Neck
Yes,
also?
they were. My father did farming of all types, and he rented land from different people in Colts Neck. And one of the families, his rent was taking care of 2 steer, and one was my family's meat, and the other was the other family's. So he didn't really have to pay them rent, just take care of the animals, and when it was time to butcher them, he would take care of all that, sending them out to get them done. But he did farming, and my father did a lot of different things. He worked at Laird's during the night, watching the stills.
Right.
And he had buses, school buses.
Which was not unusual for the local farmers.
No.
Right.
No. He did many different things, and he was the police chief in Colts Neck way back when. So...
He had many hats.
He had a lot of hats, yes.
So Wayne, tell us a little bit about the farm that you grew up on.
Well, ours was principally a dairy farm. We milked, on average, about 55 head of cattle.
Wow.
That's twice a day, 5 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the evening. There's no such thing as a Sunday or a holiday. The cows had to be milked every day. Interesting that Sheila mentioned the steers that her father raised as rent and meat for the family. My father had a kind of a deal with Perry Rawson, who was the owner of what's now known as Copper Gables on the corner of Deal Road and Poplar Road. Mr. Rawson owned a good deal of property throughout Wayside. One section which was called Gimbel's Farm because the Gimbel family from the retail store in New York, they had a summer house that they rented from Mr. Rawson, and my father used to go in and check the boilers and the generator, because Mr. Rawson had a generator in 1950 in his house, which was an amazing modern convenience. Power goes out, he'd flip a switch and he had electricity again. But in exchange for stopping in and fixing the window if it was broken or making sure the generator worked and all. My dad got to use somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 acres of land to farm at literally no cost, which helped make being a dairy farmer possible.
Right. Now, what did he raise then on the Gimble or the Rawson property?
Well, there we would do hay, wheat, corn, barley,
Feed for the animals.
feedstock.
Yeah.
We really didn't raise any cash crops.
Okay.
It was all for our own
Now,
use.
what did you do with the milk? Were you...
We sold it first to Shore Dairies down in Lock Arbor, and then the Shore Dairy changed hands, and they notified my father that at the end of the week they would no longer be picking up our milk. It's kind of a lot of milk to have to do something with. We couldn't drink it ourselves. He got a hold of Mr. Wardell, Sr. over in Neptune, and because my brother had started a milk business and had about 4 routes, not only was he going to supply milk to Wardell's, but also give them an outlet to get rid of that milk in that my brother's routes would distribute that, because Wardell had enough production in their system at the time.
And that was the day when we all had milkmen
Oh yes,
on the stoop in the early morning.
very early, 3 o'clock or so, we'd
Right.
go out and get in the trucks and load them up, and by 7:30, 8 o'clock, we were pretty well done for the day, except for cleaning out our trucks and turning the empties back in.
Now, let me ask you, did you process the milk yourself, or how was that done?
No, when I was very young, we had a small cement building with a cooler that was buried into the floor there, and that had a refrigerating unit that cooled water, and we had the big 30-gallon, 25-gallon milk cans. Later on, we moved up to the modern world, and we put in a 400-gallon tank, big stainless steel tank, and that we just dumped all the milk into it, and they would come every other day and pump it out.
Because Dave Osborne told us that they would have to strain the milk in, I guess, at his farm.
Oh, you always
Yeah.
had, straining the milk was a common thing, because if you were hand milking, you were likely to get some straw, some dust, some flies. These things would drop into the milk, and so you'd strain it, and then it would go on for processing. Now we had, for the house, we had one particular cow that, because the milk was so rich, actually when she first freshened right after she dropped the calf, it would be perhaps 2 inches of milk, and then the rest of the bottle was cream. I grew up drinking chocolate cream.
Well, I remember when we would get the milk, the cream was always at the top of the. My mother would often pour it out off for coffee.
Yeah. Well, this was an unusual animal that there was so little milk but so much cream that
Amazing.
was produced.
So now I assume that you and your brother worked the farm.
Yes, until he started his milk business.
Right.
He worked the farm. Then pretty much after he started, it became my turn to go out.
Well, I know that some of the farmers, as Sheila mentioned, had school buses. And in those days, a lot of the transportation was done by the farmers rather than the district owning the school bus. Did your father have any side business that he did, or he was strictly a farmer?
Strictly a farmer.
Well, that was a good a good business then, if he was able to support his family and keep everything going. In those days, I would assume that most of the farmers were able to maintain the property and to support their families on the farm.
My recollection, the majority of the dairy farmers were pretty much self-sufficient. Sheila's uncle, who was a contract farmer here in the township, he did drive a bus, but he didn't have the responsibility of having to be at a barn at 5 to 8 o'clock in the
Right.
morning, and then again at 4 to 6 at night. So he had the flexibility to drive a bus.
Well, now you said that there were farms all along Bowne Road there. What other things were going on? What were they raising, or what were they doing?
Actually, I don't think there were, to my recollection, I don't think there were any other farms actually on Bowne Road, with the exception our dairy farm and then Kaplan's Inwood Farm, which was directly across the street
Right.
from us. Inwood Farm, Mr. Kaplan was a businessman in New York, so he was a gentleman farmer. All he ever did was rent the land out, and other people would farm it. We actually never used any of his land.
Okay. Now, how about other farms in the area? What other farms do you remember?
Well, when we were talking about getting together for this
Right.
little visit today, I jotted down some notes for myself because I was sure I would forget something. There were about 7 dairy farms. There were a couple of truck farms. There was a pig farm. There was a turkey farm. And there was one farm that was primarily crops. But dairy was the biggest industry. The truck farms included Lucarelli's. Their actual farmland wasn't in Ocean Township. It was in New Shrewsbury, which we now know as Tinton Falls. And the other truck farm was Quackenbush, and
Right.
they were located on West Park Avenue, right about where the 7-Eleven is
Right.
today.
Well, I think a lot of people remember when they had actually had a roadside stand there,
Mm-hmm.
and right pretty much into the 60s, I believe. I remember going there myself. It was right across I think there was a shop right there on the corner.
Yeah,
Yeah.
towards the, I would say 58, 59 probably
Yeah.
is about the time they took what was the driving range, the golf driving range, and they put a supermarket
For a
there
supermarket, right. Okay, well, let me ask you this. Yourself, you attended schools in Ocean Township.
We were bused from Wayside all the way out to the big city, Oakhurst, and we went to. I started in the Oakhurst Elementary School on Monmouth Road. Day one, I was greeted by Miss Voorhees,
Miss Voorhees, famous.
and she is well known. She knew who I was. She had taught my brother and sister, which caused a bit of fear in my heart. And she also taught my mother and father.
Really?
So I felt it was in my best interest to be as good as I possibly could in school.
Well, I understood that she did have strict rules at the Oakhurst School.
She was a tiny lady, but a very commanding presence.
And everyone remembers her.
Yes, we all do.
So then you went on to Asbury Park High School?
Well, no, I was fortunate enough to move on to Dow Avenue and
Oh,
was part of the first graduating class.
okay.
Our 8th grade did half a year at Oakhurst. We took our Christmas break, and we came back to Dow Avenue, and we had this beautiful, new, modern school, 1-story, no running up and down the stairs, everything worked. It was wonderful. And then ultimately to Asbury Park High School.
Right. Well, I think in those days you had a choice. You could go to Long Branch or Asbury, because some of the kids did go to Long Branch High School.
Right.
But most of them, I think, went to Asbury.
Ocean Deal pretty much sent to Asbury,
Yeah.
but they could go to Long Branch if they wanted.
Yeah, I think a lot of the kids that lived up in the Shadow Lawn area went to Long Branch.
Right, they did.
Yeah. Okay, so let me ask you now, in Wayside, when you were growing up, what was were there any stores or anything?
Best that I remember, there were two. Nan King had a store. It was a store and a gas station. It was located at the corner of West Park and Highway 35. A very important local road, Highway 35. 2 lanes, one in each direction. Nan would sit out on the front porch in her rocking chair, and very rarely did she actually get up and pump any gas. And half the time, if you needed something from the store, she'd tell you to go in and pick it up and put the money on the counter. And she'd take care of it later on. She's a great lady.
How about, was the Bowne store in business when you were growing up?
Charliestown?
Well, I know in our books we have a Bowne store over really on Bowne Road out toward the end of Deal Road. No?
Not that I know of.
Not that you know
No.
of.
Actually, there was one other store which was run by Long Lane Dairy.
Oh,
That was the Guernsey Cow, and that was an ice cream store.
really?
It was on the corner of Asbury Avenue and Green Grove Road.
That was
One of-
the Dangler property,
That
right?
was Dangler's property.
Yeah,
That was within bicycle distance of my house.
okay.
So I did, when I could have a few coins to rub together, run over there and get them out of my pocket as quickly as I could.
Possible. Right. Well, people today would, I think, find it hard to believe that there were not stores along Route 35, it being such a busy road. But anybody that was here before 1960 knows that I think there were a few vegetable stands and maybe a bar, and that's
Yeah.
about it along the
Memory
highway.
lane.
Yeah, right, along the highway. Okay, how about, what did you do, what kind of gatherings did farm families have at Wayside?
I really don't remember the families gathering except for church activities. I do remember the adults going off to something called the Grange.
Right,
As far as the children being involved, no, that was an adult activity, and we were kind of left to fend for ourselves, the largest children, of course, taking care of the younger children.
right.
And our parents might stay out as late as 8:30 or 9 o'clock at night when they had a Grange night.
Yeah, well, the Grange was, besides being social, I believe they also were educational. They would bring information in for the farmers, and the Grange was more than local. It was kind of a national movement, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was a national organization with local chapters.
Right. Well, now where would they have met? Over at by the Wayside Firehouse was, in that area?
In the firehouse.
Oh, okay. So that might have been like the center of activity.
It was, yeah. The fire company was a very important thing to the local people. It was part of, I don't want to say the in crowd, but it was a great place for people to become involved in what was going on in the town.
Right. Well, now how about as kids? You said that you're kind of left on your own. What kind of things did you guys do?
Well, of course, I mentioned the bicycle. That
Yeah.
was something that we pretty much all of us did. we could, during the summer, go over to Kepwell Park, which is now a private lake. But that was, at that time, a public lake that paid admission. But we bought a season pass and in and out of there anytime we wanted to be. Some of the kids in the town belonged to a square dance club called Circle Teen Promenaders. As it turns out, Sheila's brother-in-law became the caller of it. He didn't become the brother-in-law until a lot of years later.
Okay.
But he was a local fellow who had gone to auctioneering school, became a square dance caller, and ran a local egg route.
Okay.
Very, very busy individual.
Right.
We had youth fellowship at church. Some of us went hunting. Wayside had some great hunting. A few folks went fishing. That was not something that I was interested in. I don't eat them, I don't catch them. And then, of course, there was, during the winter months, we would have ice skating over at Green Grove Manor and the pond there. I still ride by there every once in a while and look down the hill into the hole, and there's a little bit of water there, but there's not enough room to skate. And there was 4-H.
Yes. Okay.
Which
Where did that meet? At the firehouse?
4-H, we met at Tucky's house,
Oh,
Sanford Days.
right.
Tucky and his wife Dottie, which is my cousin,
Oh,
ran the 4-H for quite a few years. My entry was a Jersey cow.
okay. Now, did the 4-H have competition?
The big 4-H fair out in Freehold every year.
Yeah.
That was the competition.
Yeah. I have grandchildren out in Pennsylvania, and they enter things every year in the 4-H, and I help them with their sewing crafts.
It's a great organization for the kids. Unfortunately, because there's so little farming done anymore, it's not an opportunity afforded to the young folks now.
Well, now let's talk about the Wayside Methodist Church. That's quite old too.
Quite old. It's the oldest continuous operating church in Ocean Township. It was founded in 1882. We first began attending Wayside right around 1950. That's when we bought 30 acres on West Park Avenue, directly across from what was then the Long Lane Dairy. That's now the intermediate school. But we started attending Wayside, and we've been there pretty much continuously. We did take a break, went to another Methodist church over in Neptune Township for a few years, and then when my son decided to enter the ministry, we followed him to a church out in Freehold for 3 years, and 3 years ago he was assigned to Wayside, so it's like coming home.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Well, it has been a community center really since its founding for families in the Wayside area. And I know even they have a cemetery there, which probably a lot of locals are their final resting place right here in town.
Oh yeah.
So let me ask you also a little bit more about your farm. You said it was all dairy, and so you had to actually buy feed for your cows, or did you raise it yourself?
Very, very little feed was purchased. It was predominantly all that we grew ourselves.
So you did have some field crops too then?
Oh yeah. Some of the field crops we would sell off a part of the harvest, which helped to pay for things like gasoline and other things to
Yeah.
continue to maintain the operation of the farm.
Right. Well, Dave Osborne told us that they had a roadside stand to help, pay their expenses on the farm. And he said they also went to the farmers market in Neptune, I believe.
Right.
Yeah, and that was part of their daily operation of the farm.
They had a bigger garden than we did.
Yeah.
Our garden was big enough for the family, and also my mother would cook for the help. So she'd get up in the morning, get us going, and we'd go out and do our work. Then we'd come back into the house. We'd have breakfast, which consisted usually of something like ham and eggs and toast and juice and coffee, homemade jams, homemade bread, which after we finished, she'd clean up, and then she'd start baking bread, so we'd have it for the next meal. Lunch, again, had a meat in it, along with pretty much a fully cooked dinner. And then around 6 or 6:30, we'd have another meal, which she again cooked. So she didn't have too much time to actually go out and spend gardening, except to grow what we were going to eat with the next few days.
Right. Busy life.
Yeah.
So let me ask you, how about egg farms? Do we have many egg farms in town?
I don't know of any egg farms. I do know of a turkey farm, and that was Taft's. It was directly in back of our farm on we were facing Bowne Road. We had about 20 some acres. Behind us was another farm, the same dimension, about 25 acres, and they raised turkeys up until the Tafts sold the farm to George Stevens, who he decided to convert it more to a dairy farm.
Oh.
And then George decided to get out of farming, and he started a tire business.
Right.
So, progression of that family.
Right. Okay, Sheila, let me ask you, as a wife of a farm family, what do you think? How was your life and how was your days at the farm?
I was the youngest of my two sisters, and so I was the baby of the family, and I didn't have to do too much. My father would have plant different things. He had one area which was an asparagus section, and when it came time in the spring to harvest the asparagus, you had to get right out there, and I learned how to cut asparagus. And he had other things that we did. We had a big garden, and my mother did a lot of canning and freezing stuff and all kinds of stuff like that.
Well, let me ask you also, when you were married now, what kind of farm life did you have in Wayside?
I really didn't have a farm life in Wayside.
Okay.
We did have a garden.
Right.
And where we had the garden was where the cows would always wait to go into the barn. And that was very fertile ground. And when I first started gardening, I would plant stuff, and my father would come down and he'd look at it and he'd say, you got to plant the stuff further apart, because everything grew together because the ground was so fertile that I would get loads of vegetables, green beans and all kinds of things, tomatoes and whatever. And that was about the extent of my farming.
Now, did you have to can some of your vegetables?
Oh, yes. Yeah, mostly I froze stuff.
Oh, okay.
We had a big freezer.
All right.
And so I froze most of the stuff.
I grew up in the era when we weren't freezing yet. My mother, my grandmother, they did all that canning in the heat of the summer.
My mother did a lot of canning, and one thing I always remember she made was pickled peaches, because my uncle worked at a peach farm in Colts Neck, and he would bring her the best peaches. And she would, I remember I used to love to help her do it, because you'd had to stick cloves in all the peaches. And then she'd make a sugar brine, and we'd have them. And I just always remember those pickled peaches, and they were delicious.
Sounds delicious.
It was.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a great introduction to what it was like here in Ocean Township before 1960. So thank you for listening, and thank you to the Jacksons, Sheila and Wayne, for their time.
Thank you for having us.